So you want to own a fast food franchise, a logo everybody already trusts, a menu that's already been tested on millions of people, a line out the door before you've sold a single sandwich. Buy the name, follow the manual, and the money prints itself. That's the pitch. Here's the number that should make you pause before writing a check. Last year, one of the most recognizable sandwich brands in the world, Subway, closed 631 more restaurants than it opened. Not a struggling startup, a company with over 20,000 locations across the country, a brand almost every American could draw from memory. And in its own official disclosure documents, Subway doesn't even report how much money its franchisees actually make. That's not a footnote. That's the entire story of this industry hiding in plain sight. Fast food franchising is genuinely one of the more reliable ways to own a business in America. Failure rates in the first year are often under 1%, far lower than starting something from scratch. But reliable and profitable are not the same word, and the gap between them is exactly where most new franchisees get blindsided. Today, we're taking apart exactly what it costs to buy in, where every dollar of a customer's order actually goes before you see a cent of it, why some of the biggest names in fast food quietly own more real estate than restaurants, and why a shrinking sandwich chain is the clearest lesson in the entire industry. Let's start with what it costs just to be allowed to use the name. Across the fast food industry, total startup investment ranges enormously, from around $200,000 for a smaller, emerging concept to well over $2 million for an established, full-format brand. KFC sits toward the higher end. As of 2026, opening a single KFC location requires somewhere between $1.4 million and $3.3 million once you account for the initial franchise fee, construction or renovation, equipment, signage, initial inventory, training, and working capital. That initial franchise fee alone, just for the right to open the doors, runs $45,000, and that's before a single piece of kitchen equipment gets installed. Subway sits at the other end of the spectrum, which is part of why it became the largest fast food chain in the country in the first place. A new Subway location can be opened for somewhere between $263,000 and $630,000, a fraction of what a KFC or a McDonald's demands, because the format is smaller, the kitchen equipment is simpler, and there's no drive-through or fryer infrastructure to build out. That low barrier to entry sounds like good news, and for a while it was. It's also exactly why Subway ended up with more than 20,000 franchise locations blanketing the country, sometimes multiple locations within walking distance of each other in the same town. We'll come back to why that eventually became a serious problem, not a strength. Here's the detail that catches almost every new franchisee off guard, regardless of which brand they choose. The number you're quoted up front rarely stays the number. Construction costs run over budget. Equipment lead times get delayed while rent is already due on the space. Local permitting takes months longer than planned. The businesses that survive the first year are usually the ones that budgeted meaningfully more than the franchisor's estimate, not because they were bad at math, but because almost nobody's actual build-out matches the number on the glossy franchise brochure. And the spending doesn't stop once the ribbon is cut. Buried inside almost every major franchise agreement is a remodeling clause, sometimes called a re-image requirement, that obligates the franchisee to renovate the physical location on a fixed schedule, commonly every 7 to 10 years, to match whatever updated look the corporate brand has rolled out that decade. That renovation is not optional, it is not covered by the franchisor, and it routinely costs anywhere from $150,000 to over $500,000, depending on the brand and the scope of the required changes. A franchisee who has just finished paying down their original construction loan can find themselves facing a second nearly as large capital bill purely to stay in compliance with the franchise agreement, years before the original investment has even been fully recovered. Once the doors are open, here's the part that determines whether this business actually makes you money for the next 20 years. The ongoing fee structure, and it is not the same across brands. Every franchise charges a royalty, a percentage of your gross sales paid to the corporate parent every single month, whether you made a profit that month or not. McDonald's charges a 4% service fee on top of rent that runs 8.5 to 12% of sales, because in a detail most customers never think about, McDonald's actually owns or controls the underlying real estate on the vast majority of its locations and leases it back to the franchisee. That single fact changes what McDonald's actually is as a company. Less a burger business, more a real estate company that happens to sell burgers to fund the rent roll. KFC charges a 5% royalty plus a 5% marketing contribution, 10% combined, straight off the top of every sale. Taco Bell runs 5.5% plus a 4.25% brand fund. Wendy's and Burger King both sit around 4% royalty plus roughly 4% for marketing. And then there's Subway, sitting at 8% royalty plus a 4.5% ad fund. 12.5% combined, the single highest fee load of any major fast food brand in the country. Here's why that number matters so much more than it looks. These fees are calculated on gross sales, the total money coming through the register, not on profit. It doesn't matter if food costs spiked that month, if you had to pay overtime because 2 employees called in sick, or if a slow, rainy week meant fewer customers walked in. The royalty is due regardless. An 8% royalty on a franchise with thin margins to begin with isn't just a bigger bill, it's a structural ceiling on how profitable that location can ever be, no matter how well it's run. Let's trace an actual transaction because this is where the gap between gross revenue and money in your pocket becomes impossible to ignore. Take a well-run KFC location generating the industry average revenue of around $1.6 million a year. Food costs, the actual chicken, the oil, the packaging, typically eat up 28 to 32% of every sales dollar. Labor, from the cooks to the cashiers to the shift managers, takes another 25 to 30%. The combined royalty and marketing fee takes its flat 10% off the top, regardless of how the first 2 numbers landed that month. Then comes rent, utilities, insurance, equipment maintenance, and local management overhead. Add all of that together, and a well-run KFC franchise typically nets somewhere between $95,000 and $160,000 a year in actual profit, a 6 to 10% net margin. That's a real, livable income. But measured against an initial investment of $1.4 to $3 million, a single location often takes somewhere between 10 and 20 years to pay back the original investment through profit alone. This is exactly why franchise companies push so hard for multi-unit operators. A franchisee running 5 or 10 locations can spread fixed overhead, negotiate better supply pricing, and dramatically improve the economics that look thin at the scale of just one restaurant. McDonald's economics run on a genuinely different structure, and it's worth spelling out precisely because it's the clearest illustration of that earlier point about real estate. Beyond the 4% service fee, a McDonald's franchisee pays rent to the corporate parent, 8.5 to 12% of gross sales, because the company itself typically holds the lease or owns the land outright and subleases it to the operator at a markup. That structure means McDonald's corporate revenue is remarkably stable even in a year when burger sales soften nationally, because a huge share of its income isn't tied to burgers at all. It's tied to rent checks that keep arriving regardless of how many Big Macs get sold that quarter. For the franchisee, it means a second landlord sitting between them and their own building, one who also happens to be the same company setting their menu prices and marketing budget. Subway's math is murkier, and that murkiness is itself a warning sign. Unlike KFC, Subway does not disclose average franchisee revenue or profit figures in its official franchise disclosure document, one of the very few major chains that doesn't. Independent industry analysts working from indirect data estimate a typical Subway location generates somewhere around $52,000 to $65,000 in annual earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, against a roughly $446,000 investment, a cash-on-cash return in the 12 to 15% range before that 12.5% combined royalty and ad fund burden even gets fully accounted for in some of those estimates. When a franchisor with over 20,000 locations chooses not to publish the number that matters most to a prospective buyer, that silence is itself information. Here's the part almost nobody explains before signing the franchise agreement, and it's the exact mechanism that turns Subway from the fastest-growing chain in American history into the chain with the most net closures. A franchise agreement typically grants you a location, not exclusive territory in any meaningful sense. For decades, Subway's low build-out cost and simple format made it irresistible to franchise rapidly, and the company did, expanding to over 20,000 U.S. locations at its peak, sometimes placing multiple Subway restaurants within a few blocks of each other in the same city. For the corporate parent, more locations means more royalty checks, full stop. It doesn't matter to the franchisor whether two of its own restaurants are splitting the same customer base 3 blocks apart. But for the individual franchisee, that's a direct hit to their own sales, from a competitor wearing the exact same logo. This is called self-cannibalization, and it's one of the most underappreciated risks in franchising. The greatest threat to your location's revenue might not be a competing brand at all. It might be another location of your own brand open 2 miles away, sanctioned and encouraged by the same company collecting your royalty check. Over the past several years, that dynamic caught up with Subway. Sales at individual locations came under sustained pressure. Franchisee profitability compressed further under that 8% royalty, and the network began shedding stores faster than it opened new ones. 631 net closures in a single recent year alone. The lesson isn't unique to sandwiches. Any franchise system that prioritizes unit growth over unit profitability is, in the long run, trading the health of its existing franchisees for a bigger footprint on a map. And a franchisee only discovers which side of that trade they're on after they've already signed the check. Not every franchisee is stuck accepting these numbers passively, and the operators who do best in this industry share a specific set of strategies. The first is scale. A single location paying a 10% combined fee on thin margins is a fragile business. 10 locations paying the same percentage but sharing one regional manager, one shared supply chain relationship, one combined marketing spend, and one set of back-office systems turns those same thin per-unit margins into a genuinely substantial business. This is why so many of the wealthiest people in franchising aren't running one restaurant. They're running portfolios of dozens, sometimes hundreds of units across multiple brands, deliberately built to survive a bad year in any single location. The second is choosing the fee structure deliberately, not the brand recognition alone. A brand charging a lower combined royalty, even with slightly less name recognition, can produce meaningfully better long-term cash flow than a famous name with a heavier fee burden, the kind of math that rarely gets mentioned in a franchise's glossy recruitment materials. The third is franchisee organization. In systems under real financial strain, independent franchisee associations have increasingly pushed back against corporate decisions, supply chain pricing, national marketing spend allocation, and site approval practices that lead to self-cannibalization, because a franchisee's only real leverage against a much larger corporate parent is collective negotiation. Franchisees who treat the relationship as purely top-down, with no organized voice, are the ones most likely to be blindsided the next time the corporate parent decides growth matters more than their individual store's health.
So, does owning a fast food franchise actually work? The honest answer is that the failure rate statistics genuinely are excellent. You are buying a proven system, a recognizable brand, and a playbook that dramatically reduces the odds of an outright collapse compared to starting an independent restaurant from nothing. That part of the pitch is true. But unlikely to fail and genuinely profitable for the person who signed the check are two different promises, and the fee structure is the entire hinge between them. A brand that takes 4% off the top leaves fundamentally more room for a franchisee to actually earn a return than a brand that takes 12.5%, regardless of how good the food tastes or how long the brand has existed. A franchisor that discloses its Item 19 financial performance data is giving you the tool to do this math before you commit. One that doesn't is asking you to trust a number nobody outside the company has verified. The operators who do well in this industry are rarely the ones who fell in love with the logo. They're the ones who read the fee structure before the menu, who understood that 10 smaller locations sharing overhead often beat one large one carrying it alone, and who asked, before signing anything, a simple question almost nobody asks out loud. When this company grows, does my individual restaurant grow with it? Or does it just get quietly squeezed by its own neighbor wearing the same sign?